Listeners in Europe, good morning to our viewers joining from the US. Welcome everyone to this special Review of Democracy online event. I'm Alexandra Kardos, editor at the Review of Democracy, and I'm really happy to host today's discussion. Today, we are discussing Democracy's Double Helix, Participation, Equality, and Revolution in Early Modern Europe, published by Cambridge University Press in August 2025. The book invites us to rethink a question that feels newly urgent. Where did modern democracy really come from, and why does it so often feel unstable? I'm not going to tell you more about the book because we have the author with us who is going to tell you much more in detail and much better than I could do it. But before I introduce our speakers today, let me do a bit of a housekeeping. So today's event is planned for about 1.5 hours, and we hope to have about an hour of discussion with the speakers and the author, and then also open it up to questions from the audience. So we are live streaming to YouTube, and we have Luca Matasaru, an assistant editor at the Review of Democracy, helping us with the streaming and also following the questions from the audience. So again, how can you send your questions? We encourage all of you following on YouTube to use the comment section to share your thoughts, questions, comments throughout the event, so you don't have to wait until the Q&A. And then when we will start the Q&A, we will do our best to share your questions. So let me start then with introductions. First, obviously, the author. Lars Behrisch is the author of Democracy's Double Helix, Participation, Equality, and Revolution in Early Modern Europe. A part of the book was actually written at the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, which will be interesting later on. He is an associate professor of political history in the Department of History and Art History at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And he is also currently a research fellow at the International Institute for Social History in Amsterdam. His research focuses on political culture, democracy, revolutions, and political participation from the late medieval period through the 18th century. His work also engages with the history of religion, urban life, social control, and identity formation. He has already published an award-winning book on the use of statistics in 18th century politics. The book was published in German in 2016, and the English translation of the title would be The Calculation of Public Happiness, Statistics and Politics in Germany and France During the Late Ancien Regime. So this book earned Lars the Karl Erdmann Prize by the German Historians Association. And finally, I also wanted to mention that over the past years, together with colleagues from different disciplines, Lars have been also involved in a research and discussion platform called The Futures of Democracy within the Utrecht University-wide Strategic Theme Institutions for Open Societies. So thank you, Lars, for joining us today. And let me also introduce our discussants. Our first discussant, Barbara Stolberg-Grillinger. She's a distinguished German historian renowned for her work on the political and cultural history of early modern Europe, especially the Holy Roman Empire. She's a professor emerita of modern history at the University of Münster, and since 2018, she has served as rector of the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin Institute for Advanced Study. She's a recipient of major awards, including the Leibniz Prize and the Sigmund Freud Prize. Her publication list is quite long, so I'm only going to highlight her recent publication, which was a celebrated biography of Empress Maria Theresa. This was also written originally in German, but available in English translation under the title Maria Theresa, the Habsburg Empress in Her Time, published by Princeton University Press in 2022. And we also have a second discussant with us today. I'm very happy to have with us Avi Lifshitz, who is a professor of intellectual history and Enlightenment studies at the University of Oxford and a fellow at Magdalen College. His research focuses on Enlightenment, intellectual and cultural history, with particular interests in anthropology, theology, political thought, translation, and cross-cultural exchange. He is also a convener of Oxford's Enlightenment Workshop, and his many publications include the first modern English edition of the writings of Frederick the Great, titled Frederick the Great's Philosophical Writings, also published by Princeton University Press in 2021. So after the introductions, now we'll begin with opening remarks from the author. Then there will be comments and questions from the two distinguished discussants. After each discussant's comments, we will give the opportunity to Lars to respond. And then at the end, we will open the floor to questions from our audience. So Lars, I would like to ask you to deliver your opening remarks in about 12-15 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for this lovely introduction. And thank you, Barbara and Avi, for taking the time and being here. And I'm very much looking forward to your comments and the discussion we will have. Well, let me start by saying that, of course, this endeavor of writing a long-term history or prehistory of democracy is very challenging, not least because there are a lot of excellent books already on the long-term history of democracy. I'm not going to mention any particular ones now. Maybe they come up later in the discussion. And they all have their strengths and weaknesses, of course, just like mine. But in my eyes, and I discussed that, of course, also with a lot of other specialists, what they at least implicitly all have in common is that they see democracy as something of a necessary outcome of long-term historical development, as it were, the ideal form of government, the most rational form of government that at some point had to come into existence. And as such, they look for the long-term roots of democracy, look for precursors or obstacles, and then the final breakthrough or breakthroughs of democracy. So this explicit or implicit assumption that democracy had to come about for a historical book or research presents two problems in my eyes, an empirical one and a more conceptual, a methodological one. So first, empirically, if we look at the centuries before around 1800, we simply cannot see any long-term development in this direction. There is no clear development towards broader inclusion of people anywhere in Europe into mechanisms of political participation. The second, the more methodological, conceptual problem is if we assume democracy to be something that had to come about at some moment, history does not really have any explanatory power anymore. We can only say, well, why did it not come about earlier? Or why did it first come about here and not there? And why did it take on maybe somewhat different forms? But if we take it as a kind of meta-historical given, the way it developed historically does not really matter for its understanding or for its explanation or, for that matter, for its potential future trajectory. So it's an ahistorical approach. So what I thought one maybe should try and do, and what I did try to do, is, as it were, to take a step back, to distance myself from, or to help to distance ourselves from what we take for granted as a political ideal, political form, and to find out what exactly made it come about, what came before it, and what brought such a thing as democracy as we have it about, and what the story of how it came about can then tell us about the very nature of democracy. Very much as we do it with many or all other cultural phenomena, to look at them as historically grown and historically predicated and contingent ultimately, and to understand more about their nature by looking at their history. So in a way, I try to unpack our modern democracy and try to see what were its maybe potentially very different roots in history, especially in the centuries before 1800. In other words, as it were, its ingredients. And doing that, I found, or I thought, I think to have found, that first, as I already said, before the late 18th century, there was barely any substantial wish, let alone a movement for such a thing as democracy. But second, what we can see very clearly are two different things that ultimately combined with each other in the decades around 1800 for the first time, and combining with each other would produce such a thing as modern representative democracy. So the first thing is the notion or idea, or first ingredient, the notion or idea of human individuals being in principle all equal among each other. This notion had existed before, let's say, the 18th century, but it had been very marginal across early modern societies. There were contexts and situative context where individual equality was practiced or at least preached, maybe, but it was not a broad societal phenomenon. As such, it only unfolded towards the end of the 18th century. And in the second part of my book, this is what I'm trying to do, to trace the roots of the notion and also of the practices of individual equality across European societies and across different fields of social interaction, economy, politics, religion, and others. The other ingredient, which was very different indeed, was a very old tradition, in fact, a medieval tradition of political participation. And it was very different because it was not based on equality, but on the contrary, it was ultimately based on inequality. The medieval tradition of political participation, as we see it in state assemblies in particular, but also in other forms, was based on the hierarchical corporate, or i.e. group structure of pre-modern society. So those who were the highest born and ultimately, or at least in their narratives, somehow related to the royal ruler or the royal family, and those who were next to them, only those top ranks or top groups of society claimed the rule to participate. And they claimed this rule because they were unequal, because they were better, because they were higher born than the rest of society. So in the first part of my book, I try to trace the development of these traditions of political participation across Europe, from Spain to Russia, and I try to show that essentially all early modern European states had such participation structures of elite participation. Russia is kind of Russia might be a potential exception. We could discuss that, but certainly beyond Russia, there were such participatory structures in all countries, in all states. But again, they were all based on exclusion, on highly exclusive, highly elitist birth logic, inequality by birth, especially the high nobility, and then also, of course, urban participation, but again, within cities, within urban societies, also birth elites who participated. This is the first part of the book, where I then also talk about rebellions in early modern Europe, which of course did exist and were very important. But I argue that all early modern rebellions were there to defend the status quo of corporate hierarchies, wherever the group that rebelled happened to be in this hierarchy. None of these rebellions aimed at equality, let alone democracy. And all the major rebellions, all the major political rebellions, such as, say, the Dutch Revolt or the English Revolution and Civil War of the 1640s, or even in the beginning, the American Revolution, were revolts of the top birth elites defending their rights and status quo against rulers, and including their rights to participate, but not the right of others to join that participation. And finally, in the third part of the book, I try to describe how in the American and French revolutions, towards the end of the 18th century, these two very different strands that had very little to do with each other were even to some extent antagonistic for centuries, i.e. individual equality as a notion, at least, and on the other hand, traditions of political participation by elites, how these two things merged and formed the beginnings of what we now know as representative democracy. In fact, it was quite soon also called, towards the end of the 18th century, representative democracy. Of course, this merger in America and France looked very different, and it was also based on many exclusions and problems, and of course, racist exploitation in the case of the United States. But the beginnings of representative democracy can clearly be seen there, and they can be seen in the long historical development as a fusion of individual equality on the one hand and traditions of elite participation on the other. But, and this is the last thing I want to stress in this short introduction, and that's why the book, may I just show it at this on this occasion, is called Democracy's Double Helix, because the idea is that, well, these two things merged to some extent in the American and French revolutions, but they never fused. They never became one. Democracy never became just one thing, but always remained in the metaphor I'm using, a double helix, an amalgam of two different things that remain in tension, have always remained in tension, and this tension comes up over and over again in different ways. And unfortunately, let's say it also means that the two strands of the helix can also come apart again. They can unzip, as a term that is also used in biology, although the metaphor, of course, has its limits. So this permanent tension between equality and participation was not only there in its genesis, in its historical roots, but participation in the form of representative democracy remains elitist, right? We all, I guess, see that representatives mostly come from particular educated backgrounds, and in a way, participation, if proper pluralistic participation, is always a selection of people, because you have only a certain number of people can actually engage in meaningful debate and discussion. So it has to be a selection. Whether it has to be an elitist selection is another question, but that has been the case until today. And on the other hand, equality remains also problematic in the sense that it is Janus-faced, which is, I'm trying to argue that throughout the part of the book that talks about equality. It is Janus-faced in the sense that it can empower people on a broad basis as equals, empower people, emancipate them, make them equal in this kind of positive and active way. But equality can also mean the opposite. It can also mean homogenizing, leveling, making everyone in the same way objects of rule, of control. So in other words, a kind of passive way of equality, a kind of mass equality that can just as well lead to subjection and oppression and collective exploitation. Well, to some extent, this began already in the French Revolution, we could say, with the Jacobins, then, of course, with Napoleon's plebiscitary dictatorship, right? One man ruling over a leveled mass of subjects whom he could all equally tax and conscript. And we know the consequences of that. And then again, of course, mainly after the First World War with nationalism, or before already, but then even more after the First World War, with nationalism and fascism. And today with populism, right? All these discourses that stress that the people or the nation is a homogeneous whole with one aim, one interest, one will. This kind of equality, idea of equality, of homogenization, of making everyone the same rather than just equal, the same, level everyone into a homogeneous mass, undermines pluralism, undermines pluralistic participation, and thus potentially, or has and potentially this day undermines the principle of pluralistic participation and thus of democracy. So these two things are, participation and equality, are things that are in tension and potentially contradict each other to an extent where these two things come apart, and we might see the end of democracy in some instances, or even on a broader basis today. So my book doesn't offer clear solutions, although there are some ideas in this direction towards the end, but it offers a diagnosis which might help explain and ideally even counter or tackle this massive challenge that we experience today. Shall I leave it here for the moment? I've got some more things, but they can come back in the discussion. Yeah?
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for this very clear introduction to your book and to some of these big ideas, and also what is behind the title. I think the contemporary relevance is absolutely clear. Now I would like to ask our first discussant, Barbara, to deliver her remarks and questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Lars, and thank you for inviting me. So first of all, I would like to say that this book is really eye-opening. I find this general thesis absolutely convincing. And although I, of course, have known much about much of what Lars told us and tells us in the book, it was like scales falling from my eyes, that you see things differently. I think the book is eye-opening and really groundbreaking, at least for 4 reasons. First and foremost, the book is of invaluable importance for the theory of history and historical method in general. because Lars describes the evolution of democracy as the emergence, as he just said, of a totally unlikely constellation, totally contingent constellation, instead of something that had to happen with what he calls natural gravitation. Since it was unlikely for participatory egalitarian democracy to develop, we have to explain why this happened nonetheless. And by this, Lars reversed it, as it were, the burden of proof, so to speak. It has become, of course, common opinion among historians that we should stay away from any teleological approach. This is, I think, state of the art. But Lars shows what this really means regarding the way we analyze and we narrate the history of democracy, or the emergence of democracy. And this change of perspective makes almost everything appear in a different light. It is one of the most relevant consequences of Lars' general insight, I think, that it enables us, as he said, to understand the present crisis of democracy as resulting from an ongoing and maybe unavoidable tension between participation and equality, in the sense that participation always tends to get more and more elitist, and equality always tends to be, or almost always tends to be, more and more authoritarian, or even totalitarian. Second reason why this book is a masterpiece: Lars combines in a very clear and convincing, combines this very clear and convincing general thesis with an abundance of historical material. The book can also be read as a comprehensive overview of early modern European political and intellectual history, as well as a short history of the American and French Revolution, and so on and so on. But Lars integrates and structures all of this by his analytical comparative approach. His thesis about modern democracy's unlikely emergence is based not just on a couple of separate exemplary cases, so to speak, the usual suspects, but rather on the entanglement and the competition, the emulation between all of the European polities, be they princely territories or city-states or empires or whatever. And I think this is an essential feature of his analysis. He doesn't only thematize the cases individually, but also continuously connects, especially in the first part of the book, he connects these cases to each other in order to identify structural patterns of participation and factors of state building, always highlighting the complex interplay of political, military, economic, intellectual factors, and so on. I must admit that, to my surprise, geographical factors play a large role in his analysis. That was surprising to me, whereas religious factors are, in my opinion, a little bit underrated in the first part of the book, because the struggle for religious minority rights as corporate privilege were often crucial to stabilize participatory structures. Thirdly, Lars' book is exceptional in that he deals with topics that are usually dealt with by separate historical subdisciplines. I think you will hardly find a book that deals on a highly professional level with late medieval and early modern assemblies of estates, as well as with the history of the the Atlantic revolutions, with military history, as well as with history of natural law theory, etc., etc. For example, historians of the revolutionary era would thematize pre-modern estates as just as part of the French Revolution's pre-history, which usually doesn't do justice to their specifically pre-modern character, and so on. So this is different in Lars's book. It's exactly this overarching view that allows him to escape the trap of anachronistic linear anachronistic narrative. Fourthly, Lars' book is also exemplary in the way he uses the crucial concepts. He carefully distinguishes between the contemporary and the historical use of the terms participation, equality, and liberty. The basic question is which concepts are suitable as analytical tools for historians? And Lars' answer is participation and equality are, but freedom or liberty is not. Because, as he rightly argues, I think, liberty or freedom is so heavily charged with various modern connotations and with controversial propagandistic or ideological weaponization that it easily leads to historical misunderstandings. However, and this is where I partly disagree, what is true for the concept of liberty is also true for the concept of representation. I would say our modern concept of representation is so far from the medieval and early modern understanding that it causes confusion when we use it to analyze pre-modern assemblies of estates. Representation, as developed by medieval canon law, had nothing to do with representation of interests of any kind. Lars mentions this at some points, but on the other hand, he sometimes also insinuates that it has to do something with interests, which and many points of his argumentation that really doesn't or makes little sense, I would say. I could elaborate this point a little bit more here or later in the Q&A, but maybe I should say a few words about the way the concept of representation was used in the late Middle Ages and the early modern time. In the political field, the concept was developed in order to ascribe agency, liability, unity to a collective body, a universitas, in its relation to the ruler who had summoned them. So an eminent collective is taken for the whole polity so that this collective's decisions are binding for the whole, provided that it was summoned in an orderly way. And this was called representatio identitatis. There was an alleged legal identity between the representative assembly and the represented, the whole realm or whatever. I won't go into more detail here, but I think it is essential to make clear that it makes no sense in the way that the concept was used in pre-modern times to speak about true representation or adequate representation, or if there was more or less representation, because the concept of representation was a formal one rather than a material one. It had nothing to do with interests. And it's in this sense, it promoted the internal integration and liability of an assembly of estates. And the concept, and I think this is the crucial point, was introduced in most cases in favor of the ruler who needed a liable addressee for his requests. So to be very clear, this critical remark is no argument against Lars' general thesis. On the contrary, so it even supports the general line of his argumentation. But he sometimes uses the term in the modern sense, and I think this is confusing. Given the incredible wealth of material, it is of course always possible to disagree in small details like here, or to weigh things a little bit differently. Each expert tends to highlight points that are close to their experience, of course. And I'm aware that this is also the case here. So one final point, what I had expected and would have liked to read a bit more about is the significance of procedures, electoral procedures and procedures of debating, voting, and decision-making in assemblies. And this all refers to the first part, more or less, of the book, because this is a criterion to distinguish hierarchical versus egalitarian patterns of practice. It is obvious, and Lars makes this very clear, that in the course of the American and French revolutions, changes in the procedures marked the crucial turning points when participation and equality converged. Think of the Third Estate turning into the National Assembly, for example. I would argue that certain procedures of decision-making, namely majority voting, especially majority voting, but also decision by lot, for example, which Lars mentions in the very last chapter, that these procedures were a place where one could experience equality in practice on the micro level, within, of course, within elite groups only. But and this applies, for example, to Masonic lodges, private associations, smaller electoral bodies, committees of estates, etc. By contrast, traditional procedures of participation worked on the basis of hierarchy, of course, on the basis of hierarchy, rank, and status, and as a consequence were hardly compatible with the majority principle, which would count votes instead of weighing them. Assemblies of estates characteristically practiced what was called in German Umfrage. I'm not sure if polling is the right translation for this, which means every member was asked for their opinion according to rank and seating order. And there was no distinction between debate and voting in the strict sense. And this caused endless conflicts of rank, which contributed to the assemblies becoming dysfunctional and losing legitimacy even among the participating elites. And it's significant that this was different in the English House of Commons. The Commons decided by majority principle very early on, which presupposed and promoted equality of its members. And this made the Commons a reliable counterpart of the Crown, which in turn strengthened its position. So the majority principle, of course, is a matter of quantification. And quantification implies leveling the elements you count. So it is hardly compatible with hierarchy. And quantification is always characteristic of what Lars calls functional equalizing, as described in the second part of the book, like what are factors of equalizing, commodification, like capitalist economy, of course, as well as statistics, for example, counting souls regardless of status and rank. Of course, Lars is well aware of the majority principle's equalizing effect. Of course he is. But it would have been worthwhile to focus a bit more, I think, on the concrete procedural dynamics of majority decision as well as drawing lots, which is also, of course, an equalizing dynamic, as opposed to procedures of consensus and or compromise. So this is something that I would have liked to read a little bit more about. The book ends with a quite provocative statement: participation is medieval, equality is modern. I'm not sure if this, I mean, Lars himself calls this a kind of oversimplification, if this is helpful. And I'm not sure if Lars even means it seriously himself. I think this would push generalization too far. And it might lead to falling back into old patterns. And I guess we will discuss this later. As I mentioned, these are no general objections against the fundamental thesis of the book. On the contrary, I would like to even support and strengthen Lars' general thesis. I find the book, as I said, an eye-opener, a genuine eye-opener for experts and for the general public as well. And it is a magisterial achievement. Lars, I envy you for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for your very careful analysis of Lars' arguments. And I would like to give the chance to Lars to respond briefly.
Yes, briefly, I'll try, although that will be hard. So thank you so much, Barbara, for your wonderful words. And of course, we also had a lot of discussions about the book while I was preparing and writing it. And I also profited a lot from your work and from your input and feedback and ideas. And great to hear you as a major expert on early modern forms of political participation, with your critical points. I'll try to pick some of them up. So maybe to start with the the last one, that you would have expected or hoped for more details on the procedures of debating and on the moments when majority voting kicked in different participatory institutions, which is incredibly thrilling and incredibly important. William Bullman wrote about, you mentioned the English Parliament, how that happened in the 17th century in great detail. And to mention one other eminent historian of early modern pre-democracy, Olivier Christin, he also talks a lot about that in his Vox Populi, and then he suggests that majority voting and the relevance of numbers in participatory institutions then somehow translated into broader democratic practices. And that I don't follow him, and I don't think he makes that case very clearly at all. He only suggests it. I don't think that majority voting within institutions such as egalitarian voting, as it were, within institutions such as the English Parliament led in any way directly to broader popular participation and thus democracy. But you're not suggesting that. You're just saying that there could and should have been more of that in the book. And yes, I could have put more in it, maybe. I had to keep everything as short as possible and still readable. But I admit that this is maybe if there was one facet that could or should have been added, this would be very relevant and interesting also in the comparative European perspective. A more fundamental criticism or in terms of substance interpretation concerned the way I talk about representation. And to be honest, that it puzzled me, because I was kind of expecting you to say, because others have said that there was actually more to the claim of representation of early modern state assemblies, etc. Whereas I thought, at least, that I wrote repeatedly, but clearly I didn't say that clear enough, that the claim of representation of these institutions was spurious. Maybe it was not. Maybe it was bona fide. Maybe they somehow really thought of themselves as representing the whole. But of course, to the extent that they did think so, or that they did do so, they represented the whole of a hierarchical structure of corporations and not of a society of equals. And so I couldn't actually agree more with you. And in fact, as you said, your arguments ultimately strengthen the argument of the book. And I should have clearly expressed that differently. That's also why I used mostly the more neutral term participation, which is a lot of people find that a bit hard to digest because it's more abstract. But I consciously did not use the term representation in any central conceptual way, and I also tried to avoid it. I thought as much as possible, because yes, I totally agree. It's absolutely misleading. Those elites represented first and foremost their own interests, and I think I do write here and there that, well, what they try to do is to defend their own exclusions from tax paying and all sorts of other obligations which they pushed on their peasants and other subjects, or the vast majority of the population. They agreed to royal demands and were paid for them by being excluded from all of them personally or with their families and corporations. So I feel, or I hope, and we should discuss that, I hope, at some point in more detail, that I expressed myself simply in not clearly enough, because I absolutely agree, and I thought I had also expressed that, or tried to express that this claim of representation was a completely different, if it was not completely spurious to represent the bigger whole, it was a completely different kind of representation to today. And I also, in talks, or when I write small things, I always try to not to use the term representative institutions, although it is the handiest collective term, because if you say state assemblies, it's very technical, and some were not as state assemblies, or for British Parliament, it's a bit difficult to call it in the state assembly. So parliaments is also ahistorical, right? So for a kind of collective term, representative institutions often used, because that's also what they often call themselves. I actually do try to avoid that, because it does imply all these false associations. So I think in the gist of it, I agree 100%, of course, and you're also much more of an expert in this field, so how could I not? But I guess I also I express myself a bit superficially, maybe here and there, and I do hope for a second edition, because there's so many things already I want to correct, at least in how I express them, and then this would definitely be something to pick up. Can I quickly react to two more things, Alexandra?
Yes, let's do that.
So that's really quite brief. So you said you were surprised by how much I stress geographical factors in the first part of the book. Indeed, I ascribe a lot of agency, as it were, to geography in the way for the likelihood for different states in different parts of Europe to develop in certain ways or not develop. I think there's a lot to be said in favor of it. I have also heard from others that this might be a bit overstated. So far, I'm still convinced of the geographical dimension. But you say also that at the same time you said religious factors you felt were underrated in the first part on the development, emergence, and development of participatory institutions, and that might be the case. I think I do take a religion on board, both conceptually and in the various narratives, but it could be that sometimes I could have stressed the role of religion a bit more. And I think in fact your very last point is at the top of my notes here, because it also struck me already when you said something at the beginning. You quoted me in the conclusion where I wrote, so participation is medieval, equality is modern. And well, I actually, this is a bit more than just a flimsy way of provoking readers or provoking thought or contradiction. I do think, and I try to argue that a bit in the conclusion, that there is in fact an evolutionary logic in making everything equal. If you want to call that a teleology, I might even be able to live with that, because simply the systemic pressure of competition in all parts of human life and society and societal development, more and more global, obviously, competition forces to standardize, to make more efficient, and in that sense to make more equal. And that goes for production and consumption, and it goes of course for agricultural products, right? And it goes also for humans. This partly comes also from my research on the use of statistics and the discourse of statistics in the 18th century. I think making things equal does have an intrinsic logic to long-term human history. And of course, in a way, this is also where I built on a certain form of modernization theory, right? And I think I mentioned Max Weber, Horkheimer, Adorno, but also more recently James Scott of Thaddeus Skocpol, as modernization theorists of a negative sort, right? Who don't have this thick idea of modernization, human rights and democracy and all these wonderful things that we like today are products of modernization. No, a very sober and yeah, in many ways negative view of modernization, of making everything efficient, both in the economic and in the political realm, efficient, standardized, and in that sense equal, again, in this passive leveled sense of raising mass armies, of creating mass bureaucracies. That's of course Weber. James Scott is of creating mass agricultural systems or cities that all look the same. Or Thaddeus Skocpol saying that all revolutions just produce more efficient and more authoritarian forms of government. So this kind of thin and negative form of modernization theory, I think I endorse, and in that sense, I think there is an evolutionary logic to making everything and everyone equal, for better or worse. Yeah, I leave it here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think this also highlights many of the challenges that, Lars, you had to encounter and tackle while you were writing the book. But now the time has come for our second discussant. So Avi, please deliver your remarks and comments.
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to take part in the discussion, partly because I've been following Lars's work for a long time, and secondly because I really like the book and can second many of Barbara's points. Democracy's Double Helix is in many ways several books within the cover of a single one. It is an interdisciplinary and panoramic overview of the evolution of political participation via assemblies in early modern Europe. It is also an overview of evolving notions of individual equality from the 16th century to the 18th. It contains fascinating accounts of the American and the French revolutions, and towards the end, it almost becomes a treatise of political theory, reflecting on our current predicament, the populist, the authoritarian threats to representative democracy, different theories of deliberative democracy, and Lars's own recipe for partial or potential improvement. So I think this is a major achievement. And for me, one of the many merits of the book is that it reflects on our current predicament in and through history, taking history seriously. The first and longest section of the book, the one that Barbara just talked about in detail, charts the rise of political participation across Europe in all sorts of assemblies, diets, and parliaments from the late Middle Ages to the 18th century. And although this is an overview of many different polities from Scotland to Russia, from Sicily all the way to Scandinavia, I think that Lars is very attentive to detail and nuance. For example, following Otto Hintze, he reflects on the formal principles of representation, whether assemblies claim to bring together different geographical units, as in the English Commons, or different social groups, as in most other estates assemblies. He also really concentrates on the double-edged nature of representative assemblies. While they may appear to hinder the exercise of direct power by the ruler, at least in the short term, in the longer term, representative assemblies, he argues, have usually assisted state building by facilitating the pooling of resources and providing the ruler with a much broader basis of legitimacy. So the following points are fairly random thoughts that I had while reading the book, and they should not at all detract from Lars's impressive achievement in terms of breadth, ambition, and argumentation. So here they are for what they're worth. The first point is that Lars insists that all early modern rebellions, as we just heard him saying, including the American and French revolutions, were not aimed at widening participation in decision-making. They were all instigated by elite groups defending their own interests and liberties in the plural, which were anchored, of course, precisely in the inequalities that were inherent in the early modern society of estates and corporations. Often such rebellions were provoked by reforming monarchs who wished to level this playing field by introducing more equality, or at least reducing the differences between social and political groups. For example, the resistance to the reforms of Joseph II in Hungary and in Belgium. And as Lars notes, the rebellious groups were not only protesting upwards against the ruler, they were careful to maintain a very clear demarcation between their own interest and status and those further down the social scale. It makes a lot of sense, of course, that no early modern rebellion, not even the American or the French Revolution, was aimed from the outset at widening participation or introducing democracy. This is what one may call an intentionalist approach to revolution, assessing whether the protesting groups explicitly intended to bring about individual equality or broader participation. Lars criticizes what can be dubbed consequentialist accounts of revolution with a lot of justice, I think, because analyzing revolutions backwards from consequences to intentions might lead to the sin of teleology, the view that what happened must have come about in the way that it actually did. But by playing devil's advocate, we could maybe ask whether there is no place at all for hindsight, and if the intentionalist test does not place too high a bar for determining what a revolution is. Because as Lars himself argues, context and contingency account for almost everything in history. And if so, we can never expect to identify a set of neat intentions to bring about the particular consequences of an event. And if revolutions are messy and contingent, we should perhaps judge them also by their actual consequences, by the eventual proclamations and declarations, and not necessarily just by what their agents consciously set out to do at the beginning. Of course, early modern revolutions were not at all modern, but some of them, especially the ones at the center of the third section of the book, show the power of unintended consequences. Number two, in the conclusion, Lars notes that beyond political participation and individual equality, a modern representative democracy needs further factors like freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of association, etc., etc. But I thought, what about unelected constitutional courts, for example, initially established to mitigate the popular element in democracy? Such courts are today, of course, the target of populists everywhere, unless they can take over them or control them. We generally do not hear much in the book about the mechanisms, the practices, and the ideas concerning the means to ensure the durability and the resilience of representative democracy once it is already in place. Interestingly, the American Constitution, centralizing federal power, is presented as a move towards elitism and a partial stemming of the tide of popular participation that had been launched by the revolution. It is a sort of an elitist coup. Yet virtually all representative democracies have devised tools to ensure that individual equality does not fall prey to populist dictators. Franchise limitation, bicameral legislatures, constitutional courts, merit-based political promotion, these were all conceived as institutional safeguards against the sweeping power of uninformed or dictatorial majorities, of course, with very different degrees of success. So it would be interesting to hear more about ways of grappling with this issue in the age of revolutions or afterwards, because not only elections matter, but also the means deliberately devised since the 18th century to mitigate the detrimental aspects of broad participation. One further question concerns what Richard Tack has called the sleeping sovereign, and I noticed that the book is in Lars's further reading list at the end of the book. And the sleeping sovereign, according to Tack, is a scenario where there is broad and even pluralist participation in politics, but in a very auxiliary manner that does not really restrict the executive too much. This is arguably how Jean-Jacques Rousseau envisaged the popular sovereign in the social contract, a sort of sleeping sovereign that ensures that the government abides by the rules of the game, but is not allowed to discuss any particular legislation. And to a large extent, this is, of course, closer to a direct plebiscitary democracy than to a representative democracy. But even a sleeping sovereign unites individual equality on the one hand with broad participation on the other. So how do we make sure that representative democracy amounts to more than that? Or if you like, how do we ensure that the sovereign is always awake if we want it to be? Finally, just a minor issue about the Enlightenment, as one might expect. As Barbara said, we always sort of tend to approach things from our own center of scholarship. So at one point, it is argued that most protagonists of the Enlightenment tried to reach out to the people at large, and that a core motivation of theirs was to enlighten the public. So I wonder about the extent about such attempts. In fact, there was a serious debate in the late 18th century exactly about the remit of enlightenment, which Lars and I have discussed in on another occasion. We might call this a meta debate or a self-reflexive discussion of who exactly should be enlightened and how. As Lars notes, urban elites were the immediate addressees of the deluge of printed material in the 18th century. But should the common people, for example, including illiterate laborers, genuinely be enlightened? And if so, should they be enlightened by more than a minimal dose of arithmetic and literacy, which would make them useful citizens or useful taxpayers? So this was a fascinating debate, and it was not only Joseph II and Frederick the Great who were skeptical about a very broad or a very intensive enlightenment of more than the elites. Central Enlightenment figures like Voltaire, D'Alembert, Hume, even sometimes Rousseau shared this view. So Lars does make it clear that most authors in the Enlightenment did not envisage broader political participation. Some, like the physiocrats, even spoke about legal despotism, their allegedly perfect political orders realized by whispering at the ear of an enlightened monarch. But if this is our account of the Enlightenment, and I completely share Lars's doubts about its radicalism, then how conducive was the Enlightenment to the rise of individual equality and broader political participation, which is, I realize, a huge question that might not be so easy to discuss right now. But anyhow, these are my points for further reflection. Thank you again, Lars, for this extremely interesting and impressive achievement, which is also very readable. It is really aimed at very different groups of readers. And I must also finally add, a very enjoyable book to read. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I give the chance, Lars, to respond briefly to these points raised.
Thank you. Again, impossible to answer briefly and in a way that would in any way be satisfactory. Thank you, Avi, for your wonderful comments, and I'm so glad that this is being recorded, because both Barbara and Avi made comments, but also summed up things I tried to say in much better words. So again, for another edition, I might ask you for permission to use some of these brilliant ways of putting what I certainly share and agree with. So let me just react again on a few things, and it will again, as I said, be quite superficial and unsatisfactory at this point, but something to hopefully discuss further another time. So no place for hindsight, you ask, in when it comes to revolutions or rebellions. Well, I do make a distinction, which in your comment at least I maybe didn't come to the surface enough, at least to my ears. So the early modern rebellions, which could also, which some of which we could also call revolutions. It's not that distinction. So certainly the Dutch Revolt or the English Civil War of the 1640s are, by almost all standards, were revolutions. But the French and American revolutions, which made the real difference by switching from an early modern mode of resisting the ruler, protecting privileges, or as you said, liberties in the plural, against encroachments, and then switching over to something completely different. So it's not from rebellion to revolution, but it's from an early modern type of rebellion revolution, i.e. defensive, protective, to something completely new. And that what happens there, and in my reading, is this this broadening discourse of individual equality, of the principle of individual equality, kicked in massively, kicked in so much that the actors themselves could not control it anymore, as it were, right? And then had to really endorse the full implications of this principle of individual equality. So again, you're right that I remain critical of intentional narratives, but in terms of consequentialism, I would think that my interpretation of the American and French revolutions, as they then turned out, is certainly one of massive change, and in that sense consequentialist, even though they had not intended these massive changes in the first place. But I also, I think, mention, and maybe not enough, that all, at least rebellions that took a couple of years, or that went deeper or turned into a civil war like in England, did produce openings, right? Did produce openings for new practices, for, in many situations, also more equality, and for new claims, new arguments, new political visions. I mean, you know probably more about this again than I do, but already the Dutch Revolt, some pamphlets sound incredibly modern, and they had some ideas that went well beyond what most people at the time thought or wanted, and of course remained completely inconsequential, although they might have been picked up later by later thinkers or people in rebellious revolutionary situations. And yeah, the most striking case are, of course, the levelers in the English Revolution in 1647, very specifically. The levelers and the army, let's say the army intellectuals and the new model army, who together devised scenarios of representative democracy. Couldn't be said otherwise, but then very quickly were suppressed by none other than Parliament, which had won against the king, but did not want to share its power with anyone else below its own ranks, as you also said. So in that sense, I think there was potential for more consequentialism, as it were, in many of these rebellions or revolutions, simply because it created these openings both in practice and in thought. How are we going to go further? What are we going to do of this situation? Maybe we have to rethink all our assumptions because everything is falling apart. But this actually materialized only in the American and French revolutions, I would say, and that's mainly because this very strong discourse of individual equality by that time had become so strong, and of course carried by Enlightenment thought of whatever different complexion these Enlightenment thought might otherwise have been. But there was another point you made. But let me first say something about. Or maybe let me stick to that right now. How egalitarian were Enlightened thinkers really, or how much did they believe in the enlightenment of the broader parts of the population, or how far down did they think people could be enlightened? Well, as you said, this is something to discuss about for a long time, and it has been discussed a lot. In my reading, a lot of these enlightened writers, in fact, were very elitist. Did not believe very much in at least not in the short run, in the enlightenment of the people at large. As you said, for Rousseau, it was of course important that something like education would become very broad, so that people at large could take on the role of legislator. But he was also very skeptical, and then of course jumped back to the ideal Lycurgus or some other genius who actually creates the laws in the first place. So they were all, I guess, in many ways contradictory, and it's not something I think we can reproach them, because it's such a complex topic. What is for sure that in the American French Revolution, they barely anyone wanted to give the vote to everyone, to put it very simply. And CS, who was the most fervent attacker of privileges of the nobility, was also then the first one to say, well, let's exclude he didn't name this figure, but it came down to about a third of the male adult population, because they did not perform well enough, or they were not real stakeholders, as he called it, of society. They didn't pay enough taxes when it came to it. Yes, and this as you said, the radical Enlightenment, Jonathan Israel, one of his main figures, Baron d'Holbach. If you read him, I mean, he's so elitist and so clearly not in favor of broad popular participation. So again, that links up a bit to what I said earlier. This discourse of individual equality, I think, overwhelmed also enlightened revolutionaries, right? With its where they had to be consistent to some extent, and then they had to find new reasons or mechanisms like CS to exclude people whom they thought were not enlightened enough yet, but to the extent to which they thought at some point, or at what generation, people at large could also be enlightened and full participators. It's a fascinating question, and one that that should be discussed further. And can I just briefly
Yes.
To make one more point, your question about the sleeping sovereign is also fascinating, but if I start entering this field, I will not nearly end in time. But what you said about the necessity of safeguards, right, for popular decision making through constitutions, written rules that cannot be easily changed, and constitutional courts that interpret and protect them, and all the other safeguards, as you said, bicameralism, etc., etc. This is an incredibly fascinating field as well, which is also very controversial. How much can actually or should be given to popular majority decision? And the American revolutionaries, I think, the constitution makers at least, were quite clear that it has to be quite strict, that the popular majority may not actually have the power to change the system. And they often refer back to ancient Athens, where, of course, a simple majority could and did often make very radical decisions. And there were instances, at least that's what ancient Greek historians tell us, that the next day they took the opposite decision. And that was on a revolutionary's mind, both in France and America. And that's why they said we need very strong safeguards to protect democracy against the people, right? To put it in this crass way. And that's still something that today, is at play, right? So I think even some of us who were critical of the fact that the American Constitution is so hard to change, certainly since the second time the current American president is in power, everyone hopes that the Constitutional Court remains independent and does defend the Constitution. But I'm also a great fan of Jeremy Waldron, who makes very strong arguments that this is not right, this is undemocratic, that 9 judges cannot bind 300 million people. So I'm the last person to make any judgment here. I agree that probably we need safeguards to keep the double helix together, to use this metaphor. But how strong they should be, and whether we should not actually make it more possible to let the Constitution be changed. Certainly in America, I think it's way too rigid because of 50 states, and they all have to 3/4 have to agree, almost impossible. But also in Europe, to introduce new elements like maybe citizens' assemblies, as I suggest at the end of the book. I think I tend to not towards at least the Jeremy Waldron of the 90s, to abolish the Constitutional Court de facto, and to let the majority decide everything, but to make constitutions more flexible and to discuss that more, and thereby to counter the not completely wrong, a reproach of crass elitism on our representative democracies. I sympathize with that idea. I think it's a crucial discussion we are having. We need to have these days how to adjust these safeguards in order to make democracy survive.
Thank you for the discussions, for the comments, and for Lars for the responses. So we have about 20 minutes left, and opening up also the Q&A for the audience. I'm checking, but I do not yet see any comments or questions. So again, just saying to the audience that if you would like to ask something, you can do that on the YouTube stream. So it means that we can continue here the discussion. I don't know if any of the discussants would like to also bring up another topic or continue something that obviously all of these are huge topics, because it's also like a very big, complex book, which is also very readable. I do have one small light questions, but I think if you have something else, then we could discuss that. Barbara?
Yeah, if I may return to your very last point in the book, Lars, because this is something that gives me a lot to think about, namely the idea that there is a kind of evolutionary tendency to egalitarianism in the functional sense of the word, which would mean, and I think you also mentioned this, that China is the future model and the future dominant pattern for global development. And I mean, that would be a threatening idea, but I mean, this is not an argument against it. But I mean, on the other hand, I was thinking, I mean, we usually follow, when we write history as you do, an evolutionary model, yeah, in the sense of biology, in the sense of Darwin, yeah, it is emergence, things emerge by yeah, there are unintended outcomes that are completely contingent, but they follow a certain path dependency or a certain dynamic. But if we look at evolutionary biology, they tell us that pluralism, diversity, has always been an evolutionary advantage. So this would be, if we follow the evolutionary model of biology, which is of course also, it's tempting, but also not, also a little bit dangerous. But if we follow this model, we would tend to say diversity is an advantage. What would you say? I mean, that would speak against the China model.
Well, I think I totally agree. I think in the long run, diversity plurality is absolutely an advantage, also an evolutionary advantage, because it prepares different options, right, for later adaptation or combination or reaction. And this, I think, this links up 100% to what Avi said about the argument that I tried to make, that representative institutions, in big inverted commas, participatory institutions, blocked monarchs in the short run, right, were inefficient in the short run. Louis XIV could put big armies in the field in the short run much more quickly and without anyone telling him not to go to war than, say, the Netherlands or Britain or the German states, etc. In the short run, that it was efficient. In the long run, it wasn't, because nobody debated the rationality of these moves, right? Nobody made conflicting suggestions of whether to do it or not, as it did happen in the Dutch Estates General and in the English Parliament and elsewhere, which made these polities in the long run more resilient and more efficient indeed, right? I mean, also, English Parliament could guarantee credits, could guarantee debts, right? So people were much more ready to pay, give money because they knew the interest, and the money would be paid back, because Parliament guaranteed that. And the French king couldn't do that because there was no such institution, and he had to borrow for 3 times the interest rate. So in the long run, France, yeah, I mean, that's a major reason for the French Revolution. One could say that was a good thing, but yeah, I think this is exactly the same, right? So diversity of opinions, blocking immediate decision making, blocking one person or one party to make decisions, and forcing them to reflect, make compromises. I think this parallel works indeed also with biology. So I agree. But yeah, in the short run, the tougher the competition and the more brutal the competition, both economically and in military terms, and in terms of legitimation, right? All these 3 things come together. I think it might very well undermine the pluralistic debate, compromise, and participation. Yeah, and that's why I fear the most likely scenario, which I would do everything to counter, indeed, but the most likely scenario is that the world will become China. Yeah, I fear, to put it very brutally.
Avi, please.
Yes, I mean, just maybe following up on that, I think, I mean, there's a lot in the book concerning elitism, or the roles of elites, or the interface and interrelations between elites and democracy. And I wanted maybe to sharpen our, this is an open question to all of us, really sharpen our view on elites and democracy. Do we really think that democracies or representative democracies can function without elites, really? I mean, isn't representative democracy, and partly all these devices to safeguard the pluralistic participation, I mean, they're all elitist, right? I mean, the judges have to study for certain years. They are not elected by the people. I don't know, today we don't have limited franchise in most countries, but limited franchise was another. I mean, it was basically. The logic behind it was not necessarily to exclude as many people, but to make sure that those who are part of the democratic game are serious about the democratic game, and that's partly, our aim today. So to some extent, I think that within modern representative democracy, elitism is perhaps unavoidable. And even if we adopt Lars's suggestions at the end of the book and use more sortition and lot in many procedures, it might be a different sort of elite. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure. It might be a bit controversial. I'm not sure that modern representative democracy can function without elites.
Yeah. I also have a gut feeling, but it's also, of course, a cliche that has been handed down through the centuries, right? Or indeed ever since ancient Athens. Thucydides, Aristotle, Plato, you name them, they all made this argument in one way or another, and that was picked up by medieval early modern thinkers and by revolutionaries and handed down, etc. So I think we are, it's very hard or impossible to escape that discourse of we need these informed elites who look in the long run, right, to see the complexity of things, and who are able to compare different scenarios, as opposed to the masses who are emotional, look at their short run material interests, etc. It's a cliche that's been alive for 2,500 years. Probably there's some truth to it, but how much truth, nobody can of course really tell. And now with what was happening in America and other places in Europe with populist movements, we seem to be confirmed in this. But my first instinct political reaction is yes, but then I wonder how much we are not victims of our own, the discourses that we've been absorbing and reproducing. And I think so the assembly in ancient Athens just taking a majority vote on something and then maybe revising it the next day for very spurious reasons, that I think the arguments against that are very strong, already contemporary. But sortition seems to me, and of course to many other political historians or political thinkers, a wonderful thing, because it does equalize people without creating a mass, right? It picks people at random from the entire board and then puts them together. So all the Athenian law courts and most, the council and almost every office, except for a few military offices, came through sortition, and that already, Aristotle said this is the democratic element, not elections or so, but the sortition. And to combine this with a representative idea in citizens' assembly, say we find 200 or whatever citizens by lot who then sit together and then inform themselves over a longer period of time, discuss it, debate it, because you can only do that with a strict number of people, and then come to a decision. So far as I know, there have been so many positive experiences in the way that these people, whatever background they come from, are indeed enlightened very quickly and very rational, and are able to focus on this debate. And yet represent the population in a kind of mirroring sense of representing, rather than an elective sense of representing, much more than elitist parliament. So I think this is, I do think this is an option we should really explore, and I think it escapes the more or less, maybe yes, true suspicions of masses being irrational and subverting democracy and electing plebiscitary leaders by being egalitarian, but at the same time reducing, creating a small assembly that can argue and debate consistently and rationally. So I think this is a potential way out. So again, I share all these concerns, but I'm also aware of the fact that these concerns have been repeated so many times that we just can't escape them anymore.
Yeah, I'm just to clarify, I'm not necessarily supporting it, and I'm not necessarily talking about an epistemic sort of elite, the ones who know better. But, let's think of the heyday of social democracy, right? I mean, many leaders just went up the ladder of trade unions. Some other people would say, well, this is an elite. I mean, it's an elite in a way. And this is what I mean, that to some extent, wherever they come from, they can come from the most socialist and sort of working class backgrounds, but they create at the end a sort of elite of people who have the same backgrounds, who share the same interests and so on. And it is in this respect that I think, I mean, yes, maybe perhaps now thinking about it and reflecting on what you say, maybe just Sortition and Lot can prevent that. But to some extent, some sort of elite of completely different sorts and natures is almost inevitable, I think, in any sort of representative democracy.
Yeah, that just one short comment on that. There's an excellent comparative text article on revolutions, especially around the Arab Spring, comparing the Arab Spring to 1848 or something like that. I can't remember the author right now, but the author makes the argument that both in 1848 and also in 1918-19, as you say, the elites had grown from social democracy and other opposition movements, from humble working class backgrounds, but who knew what to do or how to create different kind of state and legitimacy. Whereas in the Arab Spring and other sudden movements, there were no elites, in the sense that there were not enough people who had thought about it for long enough and created some kind of created a constituency for themselves to then lead the countries in a convincing way in a new direction. So in that sense, I guess it's impossible to disagree.
Barbara?
Yeah, maybe.
Do you have a comment?
May I?
Yeah.
One general consideration. I mean, you are talking about, or we are thinking about how to construct an assembly, for example, by lot, that is able to really deliberate rationally, completely rationally, without any, regardless of any interest, particular, whatever. And I think this is a utopian phantasma of rationality, I'm afraid, although we all, of course, would appreciate that. But the question is, even if you draw lots and try to gather a group really representative in the statistical sense of the word, if you look at the internal dynamics of assemblies of all kinds, you will find that they at some point do not deliberate completely rationally. And this is why I find it so interesting to look at procedures, at the micro sociology of procedures of assemblies, to get rid of these kind of phantasms of rationality. To be more pragmatic.
No. Yeah, that's I think that's definitely true, and I think we probably could and should learn much more about how assemblies can debate in an organized or more rational way than they do through these historical examples. Because, like with Sortition, maybe some things they maybe did better here and there, and also in the early modern period, or they had thought about things and organized them in a way that we can learn from, but just don't learn from, because we think everything is better in the modern times. But so, and of course there's no ideal rational deliberation. That I completely agree with. But we can try to move in this direction, I think, right? And of course, a modern parliament with elected representatives is also very far from rational decision making. That's clear.
What standard do we have, and shouldn't we be more pragmatic and more realistic and look at the actual dynamics of all kinds of assemblies? And if you look at how lot was used in pre-modern assemblies, and there were a lot, I mean, not just Athens, almost all, which is not very well known, almost all early modern cities in Italy, but also in Transalpine Europe, used lots at a certain point of the development to, for example, elect magistrates or so. And it did not really work the way you
no, but then
because
the
it's
quorum
always
was
framed in a very minute way, and so.
But if I'm not misinformed, the logic was to draw lots to prevent cliques, clans, or families from taking over. But the quorum from which the lot was drawn was still a small group of people, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Now we're talking about drawing lots about all adults, tens of millions in an entire society. So that a bit like in ancient Athens, also of course, ancient Athens had its exclusions, but in the same logic, and it also reminds me again of what Avi said earlier. Well, how can we keep this sovereign awake, or how can the sleeping sovereign, remain not so sleepy, but also not be made too mighty, and then we have the tyranny of the majority, and maybe maybe this might be a formula again to keep the sovereign awake in a very selective way, but every half year or whatever, 200-300 different people are randomly selected from this sovereign, who as a collective is probably a danger, or is just not able to act in any remotely rational way, right? And elects certain people in the worst case, but still making people within the sovereign body ultimately take the decisions. So,
to some extent, I mean, I think lot and sortition, or aleatory democracy, as some people call it, maybe addresses the utopian aspect that Barbara talked about, because, I mean, even taking into account that we all have completely different interests and are not acting rationally, by bringing together people of completely different interests and taking that into account, it might sort of, at least play these interests against one another. But
defendants of citizen assembly talk about cognitive diversity here, and that again brings us back to diversity, right? Pluralism. The more different voices you have in some kind of organized manner, if you manage to come up with a common decision and compromise in the end, the more resilient, the more sustainable these decisions potentially are. So again. And in Ireland, the case with the abortion change of constitution, right? It was followed up by a referendum. So that combination then brings in also the actual majority, which couldn't take part in the debate, but which was apparently convinced by the debate by their true, in a way, representatives.
Thank you very much for this super interesting discussion. I'm afraid our time is up. But I wanted to say that probably we have not solved the unzipping of the Helix problem, but I think it definitely shows how much rich all the tradition is, and the ideas and the history. And Lars, you have contributed now with a huge, part of this to new also research paths, questions, which we can investigate further. Hopefully also some students were listening, maybe with some good dissertation topics. I wanted to mention also the review of democracy. We are also trying to often look at non-European, so maybe global examples. So half a year ago, we had a podcast with Tejas Parashar, who looked at radical thinkers in the modern Indian political thought, but there as well, for instance, in the context of local participatory self-rule, the idea of sortition and lots came in. So I think the more we learn about this as well, we can understand better the democracy's double helix. So thank you again, everyone who joined us today, and special thanks to Lars for sharing his ideas and introducing us more to his work. Obviously to our discussants, Barbara Stolberg-Brillinger and Avi Lifshitz, thank you very much for your comments. I'm convinced that we'll hear much more about Lars's book, Democracy's Double Helix, Participation, Equality, and Revolution in Early Modern Europe. And this was a perfect choice for Review of Democracy online event. We always try to bring new, really exceptional research results also to a larger public. And as Avi highlighted, this is a really readable and accessible book. So I hope it will reach both academic and non-academic audiences. So thank you again, everyone. And as it was mentioned, this is recorded, so it will be also available for rewatch on our channels. Thank you again.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Alexandra. Thank you for hosting us.